Hopefully, this is the Unity boot camp that you guys are all expecting. I think most of you guys know who I am. Like Dan was saying, I'm the leader of the Charlotte Alt.NET user group. I've been doing that for 4 or 5 years, I don't know. Been a member since the very beginning. I started up the Charlotte Game Developers Group about 2.5 years ago. Well, maybe two, because I started February of 12, I believe. And back then, I was actually consulting for you guys at USAC. And one of the guys there, when I was walking around, there's digital media, right? So everything around there, they had a lot of games that are touch. And I said, oh, I could do that. I could do that over the weekend. And the graphic artist said, no way you can do that. So you give me the art, I'll make you the game. So he was just challenging me. And it was a very simple game. You guys ever heard of Mousetrap? On the Android. Yeah, so I built one called Milo the Mosquito, and it was HTML5 JavaScript.
That game is fun too. My stepfather and I, we play that.
Oh, you do? Okay. I'm getting ready to port it to Unity. So, but long story short, that's what got me into it. I was like, man, I've always liked games as a kid, and I always wanted to do it. And then I just wanted to see, how difficult could it really be? I didn't do it from scratch in JavaScript. I used Create.js, and those guys are pretty awesome from a standpoint. Create.js, they did like the Atari port. Almost all those games they worked in conjunction.
Archive.org is running on?
What's what?
Like all the games you play now on archive.org?
I don't know if it's archive.org, but they've been, to me, they're one of the nicest ones because Microsoft partnered with the company. The guy is ridiculously young. He looks like 14, but he's older than that. So it really pisses me off. But it's a great framework. So it has, tweening, audio, preloading, everything that you need from a standpoint of building a game. And then it just sits on Canvas and makes Canvas even nicer. So I use that, built it, brought it back in, and said, okay, now try that. I think it was rudimentary, just one level to touch it. And he was like, wow, this is really cool. So how can you take it in? But I wanted to do more with that. And so I started the Game Developers Group. I talked to Brian Hitney when he was our real DE, unfortunately. And he was like, Matt, that is a great idea. I'm more than happy to sponsor you, meet at Microsoft, get it started. I'll back you. And that's kind of where I went from there. The first thing that I looked at after JavaScript was Unity, and everyone was saying, there's Unity and Unreal are the two. But if you're a developer and you like to code, you're going to like Unity. If you're a graphic designer and like to design and understand those tools, you're going to like Unreal. And that's
Unreal doesn't have mobile platform.
No, it doesn't. The biggest difference is Unity, you actually have to hit play to actually see it run. Unreal, you are playing when you design. I mean, what you see is what you get. It's really nice. It is if you think the IDE for Unity is a learning curve, take a look at Unreal. But it's extremely powerful if that is your demographic. Unity I love just because of the fact that it gives you the most reach from a standpoint of ubiquity. So for me, if I want to get to the iPhone, Android, PC, consoles, you can. And we're going to go through all of that in a second. But just wanted to kind of give you a little history about what I've been doing and what I've been playing with within Unity. And we'll go from there. So let's get started. All right, so here's what we're going to cover. There's a lot within Unity in and of itself, and I'm going to try to cover the majority of what we can see and what you can do. What I'm planning on doing in the morning is lecture-based, but I will show you some of the demos of just creating an empty project and demonstrating like physics and things like that. In the afternoon, we're going to do several demos where I've written a script and I'm just going to walk through that U-frame centric, so that you guys can see how that works. U-frame, I was just introduced to it 6 days ago, but I'm already in love with it. I really, really like it. When I first talked to Teal and Marty, I had my doubts about it, and just as far as, because I've done Unity so much that I liked the workflow that I have. U-frame makes that workflow so much easier, and we'll discuss and talk about that. And I'm a big believer of it now. So we'll do the basics. We'll go into scripting, your options that you have here, the concept of game objects, transforms, things like that. Assets, we'll look at the asset store as well as third-party locations that you can pull assets down. We'll talk about what your build settings so that you can target each of these devices individually. Optimizations, I'll share some tips and tricks that I know of, and I'm sure that Unity will share as well if you go through their huge manual as far as optimizations, what you can do to make your game better. You're going to have to employ these optimizations if you're going to target mobile. If you don't, it will suck. And that's just because Unity is a 3D engine. It supports 3D, 2D. It's got to support everything, and so it kind of tries to make the gameplay the best as possible. Then we'll talk about Visual Studio tools for Unity, how that actually integrates within Visual Studio, U-Frame, and then demos using U-Frame, and then I'll actually do a demo deployment of Android and my iPhone. With the iPhone, I brought my Mac, so I can show you that as well. So let's get started. At any point in time, this isn't meant for me just to sit here and talk. If you guys have questions, or if you guys have done something and say, well, what about this, Matt? Please, I want this to be a dialogue. I want you guys to get as much out of this as possible from a standpoint of what you can learn and how much you can absorb and just incorporate. And in fact, before I even get started, have you guys all played with Unity or even looked at it, or are you fairly new to it? Okay, and just to kind of get an idea, I will go very high level then as far as just introduction, but if you guys want me to go deeper into some of the aspects, I can. And most of the concepts we can conceptualize within the real world, and I'll show you that in a second. All right, so before you get started, what exactly is Unity, and why is there the big buzz about it? Just like Dan said, to me, what makes Unity probably the #1 platform that's out there on the market right now for building games, and further qualified for building mobile games, is because it supports mobility. It supports so many platforms. When, I guess, a year and a half ago, or 2 years ago, when Windows 8 was getting popular, or if it was getting popular, Windows Phone 8, Microsoft went and pushed and created partnership with Unity, even though they're using Microsoft technology, to put that into their very next build. And they aggressively got it in. The first time that they put it in there, I think it was like 4.1. Very buggy, but they automatically had that, and they're continuing to put that out. Xbox 360, Xbox One now is introduced. They're constantly working with the vendors to get that reach out to pretty much any console or any device you can get. As you can see, it's basically just a multi-platform integrated IDE system. When I say integrated from the IDE scripting, you actually launch MonoDevelop, which comes with Unity pre-baked, or you launch Visual Studio if you're on Windows, or Parallels or VMware or something like that. You can do now, as of 4, 2D and 3D game development. Previously, Unity was only a 3D game engine, and you would have to download something like Orthello 2D, which is what I used, or there's the 2D toolkit, which you had to pay for. Orthello was free from the asset store to actually target 2D development. 2D development in a 3D world is a little bit more complicated because you have X, Y, and Z when you're actually, you'll recognize this of any documentation where you look at your hand. Well, if I'm left-handed, but you use your right hand, X, Y, and Z, to understand 3D space. And this is what you would use. In a 2D game, you don't need that, the Z, the depth. You can use other techniques, which we'll talk about, to do that. As of 4, Unity now supports 2D development, and it's baked in. The cool thing about it is that the underlying engines, even though they're separate objects, you have physics and then you have physics 2D, the mechanism to actually run it, the mechanism to actually do animations, uses the same underlying engine. So if you've never done 3D, but you've done 2D and you've done animations for 2D, going into 3D is going to be really easy for you because you're already understanding the dope sheet, the curves, things like that, to make things easier. The engine is extremely powerful. There's 2 flavors really to the engine, or to Unity. There's Unity Indie, which is what I consider myself, where I'm just using the free version, and anyone can download that. And then there's Unity Pro. If at any time that you guys have games that are either very heavy 3D, where you have a huge world, you definitely want to actually build and target using Pro because of the concept of occlusion culling. And all that means is that if I were sitting down here and I was looking at Joe, I wouldn't want to render anything behind these screens that I can't see. In standard Unity, the free version, when you actually render that game, the graphics engine is going to render everything, regardless of whether or not the frame or the frustum of your camera actually sees it. Pro will actually be smart enough to actually look at the line of sight that you're doing, optimize, and only give you the rendering of that. So it makes it really good from a standpoint for mobility. 2D games, not as important because everything's orthogonal, but
So you don't need Pro to deploy to iPhone or?
not at all. And that's the beauty of it.
What's
So
the weird thing? So it starts up and it talks about licensing and how much your company makes.
yeah, so Unity, to stay in the free version as a developer or indie company, you need to be making from your Unity games less than $100,000. The moment you make over $100,000 in games that you have developed in Unity, then you have to start paying the licenses.
So we got to
If
we
you
gotta make that.
if you've made profit off of your game, so I don't know. I mean that's the fine line. I'm not sure how you look at it.
We're developing for someone.
Yeah.
There's other, but there's other, we have to go to Pro for other reasons, because they won't, some of the .NET connections for the web API calls and stuff like that.
Okay.
As soon as you include
Those frameworks.
those frameworks, it won't build.
Yeah, there's
You can design all you want, but
Yeah.
it won't build to Android or anything like that. It's just Pro.
That's what you.
Yeah, so there are some differences. Occlusion culling, some other optimizations, dynamic shaders, some pieces that make your game better. Baking is another one, advanced baking at least. In some of these terms, if I throw these out at you, you don't know. I will cover them in a second.
Colorado and Washington for baking?
No, baking. We will cover this, but in a game. So if you render a scene, if you want to have dynamic lighting so that you move around, the shadow changes where you move. That's really expensive. From a mobility standpoint, if you know your scene is fairly set and you've got this type of ambient light, you can bake that lighting into the scene. So it's one single draw call instead of actually having to dynamically render lights and configure those. That's very expensive. It makes for a really nice gameplay if you're doing a 3D, a PC-based or a console-based game that you just really want graphics to shine. But if it's for this type of device, the lighting really probably doesn't matter. So you can bake a lot of that in there, and that's going to save you a ton of cycles. Yeah, I mean, yes.
It's plane. You still have planes in front or behind it, right? I don't know if that's the right term to use.
Yeah, well, you'd be meshes that. So everything in a 3D world has a mesh, and then you have shaders and materials that are applied to those meshes, and however the light would affect it, then you can turn shadows on or off, and obviously if you turn them on, it's going to be more expensive. The GPU is going to be cycling more. So there's certain techniques from an optimization. Baking is one of those techniques to actually help mitigate and make your game appear faster. It may look a little bit less detailed, but you will never, on a mobile device, you'll never notice it. But that's some of the terms that we'll talk about. The game engine in and of itself supports both 2D and 3D objects. As of 4, we now have a separation between the two. You have lighting, and we'll go across, I think there's 4 or 5 different styles of lighting: directed lighting, omnipresent lighting, area lighting, point lighting, and each of those are important. So like if you wanted to have, in a castle, a firelight, that would be a point light, and it would only be able to shine. You can apply ranges of how strong those are going to be. Physics in and of itself is also broken up across between 2D and 3D, where you have a rigid body, which represents the, kind of us, a human body. For 2D games, you can either use the built-in physics engine, or even for 3D, or you can write your own. And all that means is you can apply your own force, velocity to the objects that you're actually dealing with. For the most part, you can get away with just letting Unity manage all of that for you, and it works out pretty well. For 2D, they're actually using what is that physics engine? Box 2D. Box 2D's implementation, which is actually what Create.js is using as well for JavaScript. For 3D, it's a little bit different, just because you have other forces.
It's all head trigger in 3D.
So what you're saying before about Microsoft is pretty much they abandoned all the .NET stuff to move to Unity
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
Xbox, and right?
Well,
I mean, all the old stuff. I don't know what the stuff is called.
you still,
Expanding it.
yes,
Remember that, right?
you still develop. So for Xbox and 360, if you were going to target that, you can use XAML, C# to target applications for that. But from a game standpoint, yes. I mean, to me, that it is kind of the replacement for XNA. It is the number one kid to actually use. And Microsoft has poured a lot of money into Unity, the company proper, to make sure that that workflow is really easy. For a Surface, I can wirelessly deploy, which I didn't bring mine. I can wirelessly deploy from Unity to the Surface device and do a deployment as long as I have everything set up for my build settings. That makes a really nice workflow. With the phone, you have to actually plug it in, which is fine. But it's getting better, and with 2015 coming out, it's even going to be a better experience. But with Unity VS, that helps bridge the gap as far as debugging and getting the same, becoming a first-class citizen like you were with MonoDevelop, or like you are on a Mac with MonoDevelop. So, but there's a lot that goes with that. Again, the script editors, the two most popular, what you get out of the box is MonoDevelop. That's typically going to be the number one that you're going to use on a Mac. And then you have Visual Studio. I've also used Sublime just because I like Sublime as an editor. And all you're doing is scripting. You're not really compiling in Visual Studio or in MonoDevelop. The compilation always happens in Unity. In fact, the number one rule of Fight Club is never add or remove files in Visual Studio. Always let Unity be the driver from the file management for your file structure. You'll learn that the hard way if you add or remove an asset or you do things. Unity is really good if you use it or if you drag and drop it into the File Explorer. But the moment you're outside of Unity and you do that and it's not running, things just start falling apart because Unity maintains a meta file for every single thing that you're dealing with. And if you try to do it in another editor or do things like that, you're going to run into issues. We're also going to talk about just at a high level. Unity is pretty cool. If you guys have heard of Project Spark, Unity has basically Project Spark built into it. Project Spark is a lot nicer because it's a full game engine and you can play and run and create your own worlds. But within Unity you have, and I'm only touching some of the top level things, a terrain editor, you have a tree editor, you can create these 3D worlds just by dragging, and I'll show you a demo of that, of just creating craters, creating mountains, and you're just, if you had touch, which I haven't tested on my Lenovo, but you can, designers love it because they can build all these really elaborate worlds, they can paint, they can create paths, they can do all these things. Yes, exactly. So they can go hardcore on this. In fact, you guys ever heard of Dan Russell Pinson? I know probably Dan knows Dan. He's probably one of the most successful guys in Charlotte that does iOS development. He did Stack the States, Alien versus Presidents, something math. He's done quite a few, but his livelihood that's all it was. And then he started coming to the Unity group, and now he was actually doing everything in Objective-C. And once he saw this, we were like, you really need to take a look at this because now you have reach, instead of trying to port everything. Microsoft paid him to actually port one of his games, XNA, to, I don't know what platform, was it just a Windows? I can't remember which one. And he said it was a nightmare because the moment he released it, they discontinued it. He was like, this totally sucks. I just wasted all this time. And he said, there's got to be a better way. And we were like, well, the two most popular that we know of is Unreal and Unity. Take a look at it. And about a year ago is when he started doing it. And he's now ported on, I think, all but like one game. And he's got like 12 out in the market. They're all education-based, so he can't do any ads. But he makes a lot of money off of doing that. But case in point, Unity is extremely powerful from a standpoint of what you can do, the targets. If you only want to stay on iOS, you can still do that. But you get the full .NET framework. And you've got these Mac guys coming back, well, I had Objective-C. We'll look at some really cool things that you can do with Unity,
So
as well as...
Sandbox, which is why it's allowed on the iOS?
Well, Unity has a plugin, so whatever happens when you actually do the installation of the game, they're doing something to actually get it to work. And I don't know, it actually runs native in each of the target that you're running it. So it's extremely optimized by the time Unity gets done building and you deploying. So the code in and of itself is going to be running as if it were written in Objective-C. So I don't know what they're doing there when they take the IO to get it so that it actually works properly. But
The same people in Mono people are doing. I mean,
yeah.
That's what I thought they're probably licensing Xamarin
Yeah.
stuff behind the scenes to build it.
Well, and these guys predate Xamarin in a lot of ways. Unity's been out for a very long time, and they've always been
So you
doing.
don't do the portable libraries like you do sometimes with the Xamarin stuff?
No, you don't. Again, well, it depends. So far as third party, what you bring in, be careful what you're going to bring in if you're going to bring in a third party. For the most part,
Probably can't bring an nlog.
you probably can. I know that.
So?
I know. Yeah, I know that.
There's something, there's certain, I don't know, there's certain .NET libraries that, as long as you don't reference them, they're okay. You stay within their set.
Yeah.
There was something in Newtonsoft's JSON stuff,
Right.
It was referencing something in .NET libraries that they didn't like. Well, that the Unity wouldn't support or that they didn't like, so
And
somebody went through and took the source code from Newtonsoft and just eliminated the stuff that didn't work, and now there's a Newtonsoft port that you can run on.
you're gonna see that a lot.
Yeah.
That there's gonna be a Unity specific port. And think about it from this perspective. Unity is kind of the lowest common denominator when you actually think about it, because you can target any platform that I can think of
That's why I
from
like
Unity.
portable class library, because it limits you to a certain call.
Sure.
You do the pound if, you do the conditional
Yeah.
compile.
So with Unity, as long as you're targeting a platform that would support it, like Windows, you can probably use that. But if you try to target Mac, you would have to find a port for that. A perfect example is Uframe. Uframe with the 1.5 just introduced reactive extensions. If you try to take reactive extensions as a library from Microsoft and import that library into Unity, it will not work because of the way that the code is written. There's certain dependencies that are Windows centric. So the moment you try to target iOS, it just will not work. However, there's a port, and it's beautiful, that is a Unity RX or UniRX, and that actually takes that out, and they rewrote it to actually be independent so that it can be on across any platform. So you're right, there are certain caveats that you have to be careful, but for the most point, the vanilla path that you're going, you're not going to find a lot of issues. If you go through the asset store, that's typically vetted. That it's going to, if it's in the asset store, they're either going to have to say only supports Android, only supports iOS, only supports Windows, or they need to support everything. And they're pretty good about that because they make a lot of money off of the asset store. There's also a 2D sprite editor. The 2D sprite editor basically was introduced within 4 to allow us to do animations, to allow us to, from a sprite sheet, if you had a sheet that had multiple characters on it, to identify where they are, the location, and how to bring those in. That's beautiful because it saves us a lot of hand coding that I had to do in Create.js, where I had to basically say from pixel 0 to pixel 256 X and then 0 256 Y or something like that. That was my first sheet, and then create an array of those sizes and make sure everything was that size, if you will. If I had anything that was different sizes, I was screwed, right? Unity handles all of that for us now, and it's made 2D development a lot easier, although the 2D Toolkit and Orthello 2D had their own helpers, if you will, that got us around that. Then you've got the 2D, 3D Object Animation Manager. Each of those are a little bit different because of 3D you have more that you can deal with, but the Animation Manager is called Mechanion, and we'll look at that. It's pretty awesome as far as what you can do in there. From a 3D perspective, you probably want to make a decision. Do I do these animations, even in a 2D, I guess, do I want to do these animations within Unity, or do I want to use Daz, 3ds Max, Maya, Poser, any of these other animation tools to build those within? There's several approaches in how you create your sprite sheets. Do I create sprite frames that every frame represents animation, or do I create a torso, head, arms, hands, body, and then create my own skeleton and inverse kinematics so that I can do the animations within Unity? You have a lot of capabilities both ways. If you're going to use somebody that's really into animations, they're probably going to use a third-party tool and just export that. And that's typically the workflow. However, if you've got just fairly simple 2D games that you've got an artist that's just creating your sprites, they could easily do that for you. And then if you have them break them up, then that gives you the flexibility to change and make any pose that you want after the fact. So a lot of power within that system. It'll take a little while to get used to it. If you've dealt or played with Flash at all, that's really going to help you because the animation engine is basically time-based. and you'll see that when we look at that through the dope sheet. The GUI system as a 4.6 actually is worth talking about. Anything before that, you would be using probably a third-party asset called NGUI or something like that. The GUI system really sucked prior to that, especially on phone, the way it was doing the draw calls, and so you really had very simple HUDs or heads-up display menuing systems. They rewrote it from the ground up, and with 4.6 and above, it's a brand new GUI system. If you're familiar with HTML5 canvas development, the GUI system is going to feel very similar to that. You have a canvas, you have panes, you have XY coordinates where you actually render your menuing system. The beauty of that is you can now, just like Canvas, you can now operate in X, Y, and Z space instead of just orthogonal. Up until then, Canvas was just like buttons, just like a Windows Forms development. Give me a text here, give me a button here, that's my menu system. Apply some styles to it. But now you can actually apply 3D rotation, animations to it, just like the game itself. Your menuing or your GUI system can support that. And then finally, if you don't have it, the concept of buy versus build, there's probably a port or something that you're trying to build already in the asset store. Unity is really good about creating what they call standard assets that you can download, and they do that probably every year. Every quarter they do updates to it as a beta, but every year they have a new version of that. But there's plenty of content out there that if you're trying to learn or you want to do things, that I would recommend looking there before you actually start considering writing it yourself, because 9 times out of 10 you're going to find it.
Will that hinder you with new versions of Unity coming out, or?
It depends. It depends on what type of work you're doing. So, say for example, GUI. If you had bought NGUI and I was using NGUI from an asset store, I personally would. I'm from the camp that the less dependency on third party I have, the better. So, for all my games that I'm doing now that 4.6 is out, I'm using Unity's GUI. There are features that NGUI now is rolling out that it's compatible with 4.6 and still further enhances it because it's still more mature. But at the same point, I prefer to stay within whatever the framework or the engine itself supports, and then if I have to bring it in, I will. Pathfinding, things like that, most of those are UI independent as far as how the logic works, so they're pretty much safe from a standpoint of being able to survive across versions. But most of the guys that you're paying good money for, the moment it's released or before it's released, they're already working in the beta to make sure that they have their updates ready in the asset store. So the more popular ones, if you're buying one that's like $10 or $5, good luck. But if it's a guy that's spending a lot of time, charging a lot of money, then you're going to typically see that.
Can they give you source code and things like that too?
It depends on the developer. Some of the developers, if you pay, they'll have a standard and then they'll have a pro version, which they'll share their source code. Several of them have that, so you can look at that and see how they're doing things. Advanced concepts within Unity that I'm shy away from, especially from a 3D perspective, are shaders. You have materials, which is actually the graphic that you apply to a 3D model, but then you have shaders, and shaders is actually the programmatic definition of your UV, your mapping, how it actually needs to be applied. Shaders and materials kind of go hand in hand to create that mesh or create that texture. Things like that, I would definitely like to look at the source code just to get a better idea of how to create my own without just starting from scratch. And we'll look at that. There's a ton of different shaders and concepts. But let me move on. Okay, so the graphics of Unity. This actually, it's actually not as good as it should be, but this screenshot here, doesn't go on the TV, is actually from a sample that you can download for free from Unity. I forgot if it's like 3.5 version of Unity, but you can still find it in the asset store and download it and play it right now. And it's got a world where you just run around. So if you play Battlefield or Medal of Honor, you can shoot. You've got a river running through with a waterfall. You've got 3D sounds. So as you go by certain things, if something's swinging, you hear that. You've got dynamic lighting. And I think this has, using particles, it's got rain in it. So some really cool things that you can do. And it's from Unity, so the source code's free. You can look at it. You can study as much as you want. The one thing, if you wanted to look at this is prior to 4.6, so the whole GUI system is the crap way. So I wouldn't study too much on how they're doing it, except for looking at some of the graphics that they're using. But it's a great example. They've got Angry Bots is another one is their kind of the main one. Alien Attack or something, I forgot what that was, their flagship for 2D development. But there's a lot of really good things that you can do here. The thing that I just want to point out is that Unity isn't just mobility or isn't just for phones. Console developers, so PlayStation, Wii, Xbox, these guys are using Unity and they're getting console level, I guess, or console grade applications, games out there, and they look awesome. So don't think Unity is only for mobile devices or the low end. There's some players that are making really good money off of Unity. I think I was thinking EA or whenever they typically write their own engine is what I'm trying to say. Is some of the big game shops have their own engine that do this, and then they'll sell that engine. But I think if you would go out and look statistically as far as the adoption from a developer standpoint, Unity by far is taking it in a landslide as far as reach from a ubiquity standpoint. And more than anything else, I just wanted you to see that the screens can look really good as far as what you're trying to develop. The platforms that we support, pretty much when you create a Unity project, you're going to get a Unity extension file format. When you go to build settings, you're going to see a screen like this in Windows. Previously, like in 4 and 3.5, the list was just that screen, that little window. But now it's they're constantly bringing in more and more things, and you can see the list over here. But there's a lot that you can target just from Unity in itself. Take note, though, most of these platforms require a developer license. So if you're going to target Windows, you're going to need Windows Phone or Windows 8. You're going to need a developer license for that. If you're going to target Android, if you're going to target iPhone or iPad, you're going to need a license. If you want to do consoles, not only will you need to target those devices, but for Microsoft, you can't target an Xbox 360 or Xbox One unless you go through a vetting process through Microsoft. What's his name? What is our new DE's name? I keep wanting. Dave, thank you. David actually can get, if you guys wanted to actually target 360 or One, get you through that process. The part of the vetting process to actually get accepted into it is you either have to have an existing game or you have to show enough critical mass to say that it's actually going to reach the device before they'll give you a license and actually open it up to let you develop against it. I don't know what PlayStation's like. I don't know what Wii's like, but I've been really curiously thinking about it. Just some concepts that I like to do to take to the Xbox and say how would I do that? But before I can do that, it can't just be a concept. There has to be something to show to them. So, but he can actually start that. So if you guys are interested, I would reach out to David to say, hey, we want to develop on a 360 or on a One. Get us started. Okay, so the basics of Unity. This is a Mac screenshot, but this is a typical screen of what you're going to see when you open up Unity if you already had a scene loaded. It's broken up into several regions or realms, and don't get me wrong, what you see here may not be at all what yours looks like. Within Unity, everything is configurable, and that's this thing up here in the top right called Layout. You can define the way you like your workflow, the way you like your windows, and you can actually apply a name and customize that. So the next time you come in, you can just select that. You can change any of the workflow that you want. In fact, when I'm doing presentations, my screen is going to look a lot different than what it would be if I had a big monitor that I could deal with so that I can spread things out. We'll talk about each one of these separately, but just really quickly, you've got your scene for number one. Number two is the hierarchy. Hierarchy, just think in terms of anything that your game has that it renders in a scene will be represented in the hierarchy, either by a game object or by a component, which is going to be number three in your inspector. That's your property window. That inspector will actually represent all of the scripts that you look at. Number four is the game in and of itself that you render. So when you hit play, that'll actually show you what it looks like. And then number 5 is your project. That's your file system structure that you have there. You can drag audio, sprites, any asset from Windows Explorer right into your project, and Unity will automatically convert that and create that and make that a usable asset. If it doesn't like it, you'll get, well, I have it cropped, but at the bottom on the status bar, it'll tell you, hey, I can't, it's not supported, or I don't know what to do with this. That's the preferred mechanism of actually adding stuff, or going through importing it, just bringing it in. If you try to do things outside using either Windows Explorer or Visual Studio or another editor, just be careful that you may have some side effects, especially if Unity is not open. You're really going to have some issues because it actually maintains meta files for everything. All right, we'll look at it just a little bit deeper. So the scene and the hierarchy are one and the same. So again, the number 1 and number 2, they're the exact same thing, just represented differently. 1 is the visual, 2 is what actually made that visual, if that makes sense. We just have different views upon them. The scene is editable at design time within the game objects in the current scene, and that's half truth. In the scene, if you're running, you can modify anything in the inspector, any setting, any property that you want. The moment you hit play to stop again, all those get reset back to what the scene was in design mode. So the nice thing I like about it is that if I want to just, well, what would this look like if I change the hue, or if I change the color, or if I change the placement of something in runtime, I can do that, play with it. I better write that down on a piece of paper, or I better remember what I did, because the moment I stop, everything reverts back to what it was in design mode. So it's great for debugging. It's a wonderful tool to be able to visualize it, modify things kind of like Unreal in a primitive way, but then revert back to what it was and then apply those changes. So just remember, they're both the same thing. Anything you modify in design time is what you have. That's going to be your rule of thumb. Anything you modify at runtime is going to revert back, and I can demonstrate that with you guys in demo.
One of the tutorials I read suggests that you change the UI settings so it's not the same color when you're doing a debugging session.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Just so you know, visually, you know that you're you're making, this is throwaway code or throwaway changes in the property. Okay, hierarchy. Your hierarchy, just like the seed implies, is just a list of all your game objects. Why do you think it's called hierarchy instead of just list of game objects? Exactly. So when you look at this screen here, number 1, that seems like a very small list of things that game probably is doing, especially when you're looking at it in the game mode. If you don't see it, it's probably nested within a child of a parent game object. You can go as deep as you want. In fact, for specific behaviors, if you want, say you have a character and you want the camera to follow him everywhere you go, we'll just make the camera a child of the character. And wherever the character goes, the camera will follow him by default using the transform. And we'll discuss that more. But there's certain things that you can do just by nature of the hierarchy of where they're placed in your hierarchy that changes the way that the game works. And it's really nice, instead of brute forcing coding it, let the hierarchy do the work for you and control that for us. So that's nice. You're gonna see, in fact, a trick that I do, especially in 2D games, just because you have a lot of what I would call background or non first level actors, the enemies or the characters, that I'll actually have an empty game object that I'll label background, and then I put everything inside that, as long as I make sure that my X, Y, and Z are 0 based, so that from a camera perspective they're always relative to wherever the camera. By default, the camera is always going to be pointing in the center, but you can have any game object be center, top left, top right, you can control all of that. So whatever your orientation is, make sure that you reset everything to 0 orientation. The beauty of that then is, if you don't do that and everything's top level, this hierarchy window is going to be huge because of the fact that everything that you're displaying, everything that you're doing. So it makes sense to structure what you're doing label things properly, nest them in there, just from getting rid of the madness, if you will. As well as in most games, you're going to be creating instantiating objects. The only way you can do that, and we'll talk about this in a second, but is through the concept of a prefab. A prefab is to C# as a class is to .NET. You cannot create an instance of an object until it's a prefab in Unity. So if I created this character, and I called it hero, and I wanted to be able to spawn him after he dies, there's no way I can do that until I actually create a prefab, and that basically says I can now create an instance of this object. By doing that, you'll actually see your hierarchy window when you're running the gameplay. Things will start it'll just start growing. Things will come in. My game Mad Dash, I create platforms. It's this 2D runner. Platforms come in from the right and just start scrolling across. I dynamically create those. So in my hierarchy window, you'll see them expanding platforms, but then when they hit a collider on the left-hand side, and some of these terms may not make a lot of sense yet, when I hit that and it triggers it, they get destroyed. So you'll see this within this game object called platforms constantly growing and shrinking depending on how many I have on the screen and how many have actually been either destroyed or how many have been created. So things like that, just to give you an idea of what that workflow is like. The inspector is basically your property. Anything any game object that you select, you can look at. One thing I want to point out, and we'll point it out again, is right here. You can't see it very well. Any object that you select in the hierarchy, if you want to be able to look at it and then grab something from something else without this property inspector changing, there's a lock button. If you find that you need to do a lot of work on this one object, maybe the camera or maybe your hero, I typically select him, lock it, and then grab something else, then bring it back. The moment you grab something else and lift your mouse button up, it'll swap that property out to whatever you currently selected. And that's very frustrating, especially if you're trying to do a lot of work on that one object at the time. Just remember to unlock it so that you can go to the other ones, or you'll think Unity is broken. One second, this thing. Okay. The game preview, just like we've seen, it's going to show us exactly, and I say that tongue-in-cheek, what you would typically see on the device. If you want to see what you're going to see on an iPhone or what you're going to see on an Android, you need to select that in your build settings and target those platforms. If the default that you get to when you start a brand new project in Unity is going to be PC. So a PC rendering is not going to look the same as your iPhone or an Android device or a Windows phone. So it's very recommended that even if you want to do development here, number one, especially from a 2D perspective, is define that resolution that you want. And make sure that you render the game in the resolution that you want so that you can see. That's not far enough. You ultimately want to get this on whatever device you're wanting sooner than later to make sure that there's no cropping, make sure that it looks good, make sure you make the decision whether you're going to do letterboxing, vertical or horizontal if the vendor introduces a new size or a new form factor. You're not going to be able to have everything fit perfectly for every single game that you're doing just because of, at least from a 2D perspective. 3D typically will work pretty well as the way the camera works, but 2D, you're always kind of letterboxing or trying to look at it from a single orthogonal view. Okay, and then the project.
So when you're developing on multiple platforms, how much of the code is all the same code? You don't have two copies of the code?
I don't have. I personally, for the games that I've done, mine are very simplistic 2D games. I've never had to have duplicate copies. The one thing that I've had to do is make sure that my sprites, make sure that my camera is set up so that, and you can write in code to actually dynamically change the size of your camera so that it supports the platforms that you want. So for an iPhone, 320, what is it? 320/96. I forgot what before 5, but 320 was the rule of thumb for me. When I was looking at it, and I would try to design. Okay, well, do I want to do it portrait? Do I want to do a landscape? Do I want to have it locked? Do I want to allow it to be able to go this, so that it'll flip either way? And those are fine, but just make sure that it renders fine. I typically target for that and then take a look, and then I will drop in a camera script that, depending on the platform or depending on what the device tells me of its resolution, then I dynamically resize the camera so that it fits and tries to fit as best as possible. GUI was one area that was really painful. The 2D, the Unity engine does really good with the game, but the GUI itself would not scale properly, so you would have things cropping or coming off that didn't look well. The only time that you have to be really careful about making sure that it's pixel perfect or that things render properly are multiplayer games that you're network based. So the game I'm doing right now is a remake of Joust. It's called Pirate Duel, and within that, if I'm playing somebody, I've got to make sure that my ostriches that are flying are rendered in the same place on this screen as they would be on here, even though I'm completely different form factors. That's the only thing that can drive you crazy. Even Unity, the Unite 2014, there's a great session on 2D development for making sure that screens are set up the same way. Says that that's one of their weakest points as far as making it easy. If you were wanting to have something that you got that for free, the best 2D game engine out there in the market that does that for you already is based on Lua. Why can't I think of it? Corona. Corona will do that automatically for you. So there's certain tools, but it's only 2D, and it's finally just come to Windows, I think. But that's such a small piece of the overall game development that you're doing that you'd have to deal with, that it's typically solved by using the camera scripts or something else as you go forward. So, but yeah, that's a good question. There may be specific things as far as sizes. So, if you want to target PC, tablet, and iPhone, at least, and this is what Dan recommends as well, Dan Russell Pinson, is that he actually has 3 different sizes of his assets. So a low poly, medium, and then high poly, and then based on the device that when your game launches, it can either load those assets or not. The nice thing about that is when you actually send it to the store, Windows will automatically pick the right one appropriate for you, which is pretty cool. If you bundle it, Windows will do that automatically for you. For iOS, you have to have a switch, but it's pretty easy for it to check within Unity to say, okay, here we're going to use, based on your resolution, we're going to use this level of assets. But there's tricks around that. Typically, it's still one code base. There may be certain things, if you're trying to deal with a device-specific feature, that you'll need to go low level, but for the most part, most games, it's input. So am I going to use a joystick or is it touch? What is that form factor? But the gameplay in and of itself typically can be across the board. You don't have to do a lot of changes. And I forgot, I should have brought, I have Moga, iCade, and I have a third one that I just got that I can actually target and run joysticks off of my iPhone or my Android over Bluetooth, which is really cool because my kids, again, they're my beta testers, but they're the ones that make sure that everything works properly. And I like doing it. I actually downloaded a third-party asset called InTouch or InControl. I think I told Marty wrong. InControl, it has a touch component, but it's universal, so it'll support 360 controllers, Wii controllers, all of those, and you don't have to write all that custom code to actually do the mapping. So little things like that make life a lot easier. Okay, so when we first start up the editor, you're gonna find that the top part of this, the toolbar, is going to be either your best friend or not. The menu bar in and of itself. There's a couple things that are going to make your life a lot easier when you want to interact within the scene. As you are developing in the scene, you're going to notice that maybe your camera has gotten skewed or gotten out of place. The way that you would get around that or to fix things are these top panning, rotating, and scaling, and hand, I guess, is dragging. Each one of these are extremely powerful in and of itself, but then they have key presses that can actually change the mode that which you're in. If you just click and drag when you have the hand selected, it's just going to move around within the camera you're seeing. If you hold the Alt and click and drag, it's going to create a pivot point so that it'll actually move whether or not you're in 2D or 3D mode. And this doesn't show it here, but you actually have the option to be able to switch your camera from perspective to orthographic view as well. Orthographic is 2D, so you're looking straight on. Perspective, so say for example, if I'm a camera and I want to render your scene, here's the background for my scene. If I were to move this and this is front and center of the camera, it would look perfectly flat. As I move, it's actually going to, as I move away from the camera, it's actually going to get skewed and actually look from a camera perspective that it's been angled, and that's because it's perspective. So if you don't like it and you're doing a 2D game, make sure you're in 2D mode, but otherwise you need to be able to adjust for that and have a camera either follow it so that it always looks orthographic or straight on, or be aware of, oh, well, I really didn't change my X or my Y axis, but because I moved it further away from the camera, it appears that it has done that, and that's part of perspective. So little things like that, you're going to notice, well, what? I just moved it a little bit away from my camera. Why is it doing that? And some tricks that we can get into that. Where did I go? Oh, okay. We will play with, well, and you guys, I'm sure, will play with all of these quite a bit when you first start doing this and getting started. You also have your ability to test your pause, you play, or to step through frame by frame if you want to just slowly go through and see what's actually happening. And then you have something called layers and layout. Layers is the ability to, especially in a 2D, well, in the 3D as well. Say, for example, I went from my gaming perspective in a 2D game. I want to do parallax scrolling. You guys understand what that means when I say parallax? So, if you're in a car and you look out the window, the mountains move really slowly. The hills move a little bit faster, and the grass right by the road is just going really fast. That's parallax scrolling. If you wanted to support that, you could actually create multiple layers so that the furthest layer back for the camera would move really slow. The next layer would move a little bit faster, and so forth. Unity 2D and 3D support all of that in place for us to have that. But it makes it nice because you can then define, if you have layers, what occludes what. So maybe you have now trees and shrubs. Well, a tree should be occluded by the grass, but never by a shrub. It's always going to be topmost. You can put them on these different layers, and the draw, the way it renders it from a Z perspective, even though it's in reality flat from a camera perspective, the Z perspective, it actually adjusts it. And so using layers instead of setting the Z, or which we'll look at in the property inspector, is going to make your life a whole lot easier, because then you can group things and say, well, this is my shrub layer, this is my mountains layer, this is my clouds layer, and they all can then be adjusted accordingly to what happens or how you want your gameplay. If you wanted fog, and then like when they die, you want that fog to cover everything, you could easily just switch the layer so that it renders it topmost and then goes back to where it was. So little things like that make life a lot easier. Layout, we discussed already, is just the ability to, just like in Visual Studio, where do I want my panels? How do I want them to show up? There's some pre-built or predefined full, wide, 2x3, 4 definitions. But for the most part, when you start developing, you're going to say, well, I need the animation window, I need the animator window, I need the U-frame window. I want all these up. You're going to find that you're going to be customizing it and changing it out. The other thing to keep in mind when we start looking at that is that most of the panels have a zoom scroller on the bottom that either can scroll out to be like large icons or as small as possible. Not only that, but then you actually have certain windows that default to either 2-column or 1-column. I prefer 1-column so that I can get as much into my screen as possible, but it's up to you, and we'll look at that when we start playing with the editor itself. Okay, the scene window. More than anything else is basically, and it's really hard to see what we're looking at here. This drop down right here allows you to render your scene either fully rendered as if you were actually kind of looking at it from a game perspective, or right now we're seeing it as wireframe. So everything would show up as a wireframe. There's a button missing here from a scene perspective, is that's 2D or 3D. If it's 2D, this is going to look a lot more flatter, orthogonal. If it's 3D, it's going to be definitely perspective, like you're seeing here. in the selection of the wireframe, you're going to get a lot of other selections of modes that you can go into. What coloring concepts do you want to turn lighting on and off? Trying to think of anything else that's really important from the scene. The biggest thing is whatever you deal with the panning, the rotation, the zooming, and the scaling are going to directly impact how you interact with your scene. Say, for example, you've got a big scene that you've got in 2D mode, and you actually want to go back and be able to find a single object on your hierarchy. If you hit your hierarchy or you select it in your mouse, and then you hit the letter F, it'll always bring the camera and zoom it in on that object in and of itself. So if you're trying to find, what happened to that one platform that I was working on or that I was dealing with, I've messed up my perspective so bad that I just can't find it. Selecting that, hitting F will automatically bring that back in, and I'll walk you around showing you that. In fact, you know what? I'm gonna switch over just so you guys can see, because this is there's a lot of stuff going on here that kind of catch up to where we're at. The one thing to be aware of is that when you run Unity, it's always going to remember the last project that you had. So I'm just going to start a new one, just so that we're vanilla. Oh, you know what? I want to do another one. The reason being is I want to show you a couple things here. All right. So number one, this list is going to vary depending on what packages that you purchased yourself. It'll take some time. So if you have Visual Studio for Unity, that should be in this list. If you have UFrame, that should be in this list after you've installed it and brought it in once already. Other third-party projects, it just depends on what you bring in. This is probably the most important thing. You can change this after the fact, but it's so much easier just to do it here. Whether or not you're going to target a 2D or 3D game. So, and what that does is it sets up the cameras and either creates an orthographic or perspective. But it makes your scene and your environment ready for each one of those. I'm going to do 2D. And just show you. And I'm going to also bring in the Visual Studio tools, which is right here. Can you see that okay? Or not? And then there's UFrame as well. But
So if you already created your project, how do you add packages?
I'll show you. So I didn't bring in UFrame, right? Oh, shoot, I need to bring that. Well, what I would go here is go to Assets, Import Package, and if it's here, I would just bring it in. UFrame isn't here, so which we're going to touch on this, but since you want to jump again, it's all right. Asset Store. I would go to the Asset Store, and then everything that I have purchased is going to show up here as long as I've authenticated. You guys won't see this if you've never gone to the Asset Store. You have to create an account, and then you have to authenticate. Right now, I think that I have this already in my settings set up to go straight there. In fact, I can purchase right here and spend some money. So
does each developer need to purchase the same asset?
well, for your perspective, you might want to have every developer using a Logical Advantage account with a cap on how much you want to spend. Yeah, that's a good question. You can share packages, so you could put on Git or something like that the packages that you guys purchase as a company, and then say, okay, everybody pull it down from there. It doesn't make the workflow as easy, but you can still import manually packages, just like where I did that import. You can actually browse to a location and bring those in as well. So that may be a better workflow for what you're trying to do. For me, being an indie, it's really nice for me to see everything that my personal account has, and just be able to play with those. So that's an excellent question, because you guys need to figure that out and how you actually want to deal with that, so that you set up even in a network share. Here's all of our packages for what we're doing. Go out and grab them from there.
Okay.
So, but yeah. So for bringing in, let's say UFrame, your list probably will be extremely small, and you probably won't have anything. There may be some Unity ones that are free that will just come up. But if I wanted to bring in UFrame, this is alphabetized, so I'm just scrolling down. I would just say import right here. I'm not going to do it for this example, but because it's actually going to take a second to, at least it should. I did click it, didn't I? Oh, okay. There we go. So it's decompressing the package. And then the nice thing about Unity is that there may be packages that you buy, and then you're like, I could care less about the sample. I just want the engine or the library that it has, and I just want to use it. Or, you know what? I don't want all the assets or all the extra arts and artifacts that they have because it's going to bloat my project. One thing to keep in mind, when you are developing for Unity, you can bring in as many third-party libraries as you want, but unless it's included, that individual asset's included in a scene in your game, it will never get bundled in the executable. So don't worry that if you brought in this huge import that's got a ton of files like this one, or a ton of shaders, that your game now just exploded by the size of your project structure. It's only going to be the size of whatever you've targeted within each of your scenes. And you could have more scenes, one scene or no scenes, or only one scenes or n number of scenes that could be represented there. So for here, I'll just leave this in default just to show you. I'll go ahead and import it. Make Dan happy. And so this is going to be doing this behind the scenes. Your asset store, though, will look differently depending on what you brought in. If I click this again, once it's done importing, this should toggle me back and forth between the home and it's still thinking. There we go. Yeah, come on. I don't want to close it. This thing is slow. There we go. Oh, that's right. I'm going across your Wi-Fi as well. So, all right. So now, hopefully, it's in place. I should be able to toggle back. You know, and so say for example, I don't know what we were talking about. Logging. I can check to see. You know, if are there any logging. Here's a list of just what loggers are available right now as packages, whether they're free or not, and see if maybe there's already something out there. If it's here, it's gonna work in Unity. You got to be careful to make sure what version and what platforms that it work for. But at least they vet that much, you know, to make sure that that's part of it. All right. So again, within my scene, you've got your hand, the ability to resize, to rotate, to scale, and then to change the camera perspective from center or global. You also have, I meant in scene, you also have this. You can go between 2D or 3D perspective. Because I set my game up as a 2D game, it defaults to 2D, and with my camera being 100% orthogonal, I can zoom in and out, kind of looking at my back canvas that I'm rendering on. But you'll see that when I look at it from this perspective, I'm actually trying to show perspective and show the scene of what the game would actually look like. I can show it as textured wireframe, textured wire. Since there's really nothing here, there's not a lot to see. But let me drop something on here, and this is gonna. I don't know if I can drop a 3D object in it. Let's try this. Oh, and watch this. So I'm gonna move out here. I've got cube selected. If I hit F. Oh, come on. There we go. That was weird. Why it took so many presses. By hitting F, you should automatically adjust your camera perspective so that it's looking straight at that object. And to prove that I'm not a liar, because Mark's looking at me funny, I'll do a sphere. And I'm just gonna go over here. This is another thing that's kind of nice if you like it. Any of these in the property grid, if they're numeric, you can just hover over the label and just scroll, just to change that property value in and of itself. So now, and the other thing, I have a whole, I think 2 or 3 slides on hotkeys. These slides you guys will have, but not only for Unity but for Uframe as well. But I'm very much a keyboard guy, so as much as I can in the keyboard, I like to do that. And then if I have to use my mouse, I will. What you're going to if you're going to be dealing with the scene. But with the property grid and stuff like that, and with switching between all of these styles and ways of doing this, I can just do W or Q, W, E, and R, and just swap between that. So let me select the cube just to give you an idea. So if I wanted to rotate, I can just grab this and see how you kind of see. It's kind of hard to see, but these different colors, each of those represent an axis that you're dealing with. So I can grab it, they turn yellow once I select it, and kind of give you, okay, that's how that's working. Oh, you know what? F, it's just double clicking. I thought F would do it as well. Maybe that's only Mac. It shows it here. Oh, you have to be in the scene. Okay. So, as long as your cursor is in the scene and you hit F, it'll automatically go to it.
So pick it and then.
Yep.
Click, go over the same.
Yep. Now, if you find that that's too much work, just double click it. Yeah. So just little things like that. But so you'll have that. You'll want to be able to play with those and just go back and forth as far as rotating. The key presses here allow us to swap in and out and change that. If I were to run this, I don't even know. That's what we're going to see. I have no lighting. I have nothing. I have no background. Nothing here. So that's what's going to look like. And we'll do a couple things with that. What else within the scene? I think. Okay, gizmos. Sometimes when you're developing, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an empty game object. A very common practice in 2D games is, say for a platformer game, is maybe you want to give the ability for them to do jump or multi-jumps. So, they get this bonus and they can do 2 jumps in the air, for 30 seconds or something like that, then it goes back. There's some tricks that you can do to help Unity know whether or not you're on the ground. We'll talk about at a very high level the concept of raycasting. Raycasting, this is a perfect example. So my laser, in fact, there are actually commercial lasers like this that will actually tell me the distance. So when I click this, it'll actually tell me exactly how many feet or meters that I am from that. That's the exact same concept of raycasting. It's extremely efficient, and it is probably the best way to do distance judging from any other object in your world, whether it's 3D or 2D. Instead of actually maintaining these objects and as they move, having some sort of observable, keep track of all of that. Using raycasting is much faster. You can have a single ray, or you can have a parallel set of rays that are getting thrown to do that. But the reason why I bring that up is that with raycasting, I typically would say, maybe I'll call this foot, I'll call it this floor. That's what I would call mine. Floor, and I'll create another one. Create empty, and this one will be called ceiling. And then what I'm going to do, and make sure they're zeroed out, I'm just going to make them children of my cube. Still, I'm not getting a lot from this, right? It's not helping me too much, but let me take the ceiling, I'm going to change the Y.
What is floor and ceiling?
I'll show you. So what I'm trying to do, if I had a platformer game that I wanted the character to run, and maybe he's going through a hall, and if he jumps, he hits the ceiling. If he's off the ground, I need to know that he's off the ground, so I need to have something to determine when am I touching the floor, when am I touching the ground. So you need to deal with that. So what I'm doing is I'm putting this guy up here, and I'm calling him ceiling, and I'm going to go here and give him a gizmo, so that you can actually visually see that in the designer. And then I'll go to floor, and I'll make floor blue. I'll bring it down a bit. And then I'll do the same thing. I really like this in that I can, and especially from a 2D, if I were...
Are you selecting a plane on the cube, or just what are you selecting?
Oh, these guys are actually child objects, the nesting. So I just nested them. Let me...
So there's a plane that's a separate object from the cube.
Yes, let me show you something. I'm going to go back to 2D, and I'm going to create sprites, because this will be easier for you guys to visually see it. I'll create a single sprite.
The floor and the ceiling, they're game objects.
Say that again?
Are the game objects the floor and the ceiling that you created?
Yeah, everything is a game object in the concept of the scene. So if let me do something. So let me add game object, and I add a quad, and I'm just going to scale it out in the wrong way. So let's pretend this is a 2D platformer game, and all I'm trying to do is just set it up so that I can. That's good. Now this is my floor, okay? Then I created this sprite. I'm going to call him hero or player. And on this sprite, you see that there's nothing. A sprite, you need a sprite sheet or something like that. I'm just going to grab a knob or something like that. Just anytime you select over here, when you want to set something, there's these little dots that you can select, and that'll actually bring up these property grids. That's really the only way you can actually interact with it. So you click on that, it comes over here. The one thing that I find annoying is that I have to select something and then hit close. Well, the easier way is just double click again. By double clicking, it selects it and it closes it out. So once you remember that, it's going to save. Again, it's a little bit of a stroke, but those add up, right? And you get tired of, my goodness, why am I having to do all that? But all I'm trying to do is I wanted to select a sprite so that I could render my 2D object. With this guy, I'm just going to scale him just a little bit so that I can get make it look more like a person height. So I'll maybe do. That's probably okay. And then now, actually, I'll scale it even more because I want it to really. There we go. And maybe make him a little bit bigger. This looks more like Mark now. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add an empty game object. Sorry, Mark, I didn't mean to do that. I'm going to call this ceiling again. And what I want to position, because he's just relative to everything, I need to drag and hover over player so that it becomes a child of that. Now when I move him, he's now in the context or relative to the player's position. Wherever the player moves, he will move. But his X, Y, and Z still need to be adjusted so he's not in the middle of the player. So all I'm going to do here, now that I have him inside the player, is just grab this arrow, since the ceiling is go right up here. And I just want to say, this is, if anything hits this is going to be the ceiling. And then for me to visually see that, since it has no graphical representation, in the game I don't want you to see it, right? But I still want to see it in the designer so I can grab it or look at it and say, do I even have a ceiling? I'm just going to do that. If I wanted to copy that, I can do Control D. Control D or Command D if you're on Windows, duplicates any object that you have selected. Okay. I'm not going to do that just because I want to show you another way that you can do things. If I have this selected, I can go to Game Object and say Create Empty Child. And that'll put it inside there. Otherwise, I can right-click this guy and say Create Empty, and that'll put it inside there. Whatever object I have selected, it'll add it. When I add this guy, and I just say Floor, I'll change this to blue. And then I'm just going to grab this and move him down. So now I have a ceiling, I have a floor. That'll help me when I'm doing ray casting to be able to say, well, am I hitting something? If I were to try to do this right now, well, we'll jump to physics really quick. Just because
those are not inside the player object, though. Like you can drag that floor below the player.
Mm-hmm. It's relative to the player. It could be, I could have it 5 feet in front. In fact, when you're dealing with 2D, well, when you're dealing with FPS type games, first-person shooters, where you're dealing with anything that you actually have a gun, that the bullet that comes out of the gun, you don't want it to actually be within the realm of the player because then you would get a hit, right? If your collider, which we haven't talked about colliders yet, but if your collider was a little bit bigger than your player, and then you held a gun and you got short arms, like, well, I'm not going to make fun of anybody. You got short arms, so the bullet, when it leaves, it's still within the collider, you would actually hit yourself. So there are times that you actually want it further away from the actual object, game object you're dealing with. Here I'm just showing you it can be inside, but there's no constraint that it can only be within those bounds. It's up to you to define what you want it to do. I want it to be at the thresholds of the head and then of the foot, just because I know that if something hits the head, I want it to be realistic and say, oh, I just hit my head, I can't go any higher. or if I'm dropping down. One thing that we haven't done here is that this quad has a mesh collider, which I could use, but well, I really can't. I need to add a 2D, because this is a 2D game. I need to add a 2D collider so that I would know that I'm hitting it. But if I run this right now, he's just sitting there, right? Nothing's happening, and that makes perfect sense because there's no physics involved. In order for me to enlist into the physics for this player, in fact, I'm going to show you another piece, and I'll jump back to my slides in a second. I can go here. This game object, I can add things either through the component or the game object by creating empties, and then go here and add 2D. What I would want to do is add a rigid 2D body, and that would make me enlist into the physics engine of Unity. The moment I do that, then I have to honor all concepts of gravity. Sprite render. Or I can do here and say, oh, I got a filter. Add it through here and just say 2D, rigid 2D body. I can adjust my mass, and all these properties that you see here, you can access also from scripting, because there may be certain things that, like when you get hit, you may want to blink for a second and then freeze gravity so that you're just pause, and then go back into reality again. You can do all these things by manipulating these projects, but watch this now, and you might have to watch quickly because this is I think I'm at 30 frames per second or something like that. It's going to fall. And it fell through that quad because it had no idea that they were supposed to collide with that. And let's see what we can do to actually deal with that. This sprite that you see here, this player object, has a transform. A transform, literally what it means is where am I in 3D space or 2D space. Regardless if you're 2D or 3D, you always have X, Y, and Z. It has, because it's a 2D game, it has a sprite renderer. It means, what am I supposed to look like? I'm 2D, but I still need to have a view, and I just grabbed what came out of the box. And then I added a rigid 2 body, and that means honor physics. What it doesn't have is anything to actually tell me, how do I know I've collided with something? So I'm going to go here, I'm going to go back to physics, and number one, especially for mobility, it's not as important for PC or consoles, but you still want to be optimized. You want to pick the collider that deals with the least amount of polygons. So you wouldn't want to pick a polygon collider and then draw multiple points of something that is as simple as either a rectangle or a sphere. Here I'm just going to pick a box collider. See how it's larger? You may not want that, so then you can adjust its scale for the collider itself. And I'm going to say it's, oops. Maybe I'll.
Can the collider just take on the shape of whatever it is?
It should. It should. Typically, typically it will. I can't even see what it.
That's kind of like in the webs or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Or the collider's
For the most part, it
Oh, I
tries.
see. That's what you're talking about, polygons.
Yeah, for the most part, it'll try to honor whatever shape that you have. But because I was scaling mine, it may skew it a little bit as far as how it determined where the collider bounds are. Right now that I have a collider, and if I hit run again,
Wouldn't your floor be your collider?
yes, you need both. That's what. Yeah, got a guy that's. Damn it! He took all my pizzazz. Okay, so you're right. So now let me go ahead and add a box collider here. Oh, so let me remove the quad. I'll create a 2D object. I wonder if I can just do a cube. See if I can add a 2D box collider. No. All right. So let me pick a sprite again. There we go. And then scale this guy out. And then what I'm going to do is just add a collider, and I'll do a box collider. See how it's showing there? So now, if I I'm now sticking there.
So you made a collider there that's that entire shape instead of making one for the feet and one for the...
Yes. Depending on your game, the lower number of colliders, the better. Again, just from an optimization standpoint. From a 3D model, the less number of triangles. From here, the lower amount of colliders is going to be better because that way it has less to maintain. If you can get away with that. But typically, I will do, if I'm actually moving and the terrain is uneven, I will not use a box or a rectangle for the base of my body. I'll always make it a sphere because circles can bounce and can go over shapes that are irregular. If I were trying to go over something and I just had a slight difference in the elevation of my game, I would be stuck there and that would really suck. But if I had a circle, you get a little bump and you go over it. So that's what you would want. So yeah, let's adjust that because that's an excellent question, and a lot of times that's what you're going to want. For my collider, then I would still have it for the torso and the body, but then I would just kind of change the, oops, wrong way. That's really not 0.7. There we go. And then I'll just center. There we go. So 0.02. Now what I'll do here is add another collider. And this one will be a circle. And of course, I want to change. Oops. I'm going to do that. I was hoping I could adjust it there, but I can't. So the size is going to be, oh, thank you. Radius. So I'm going to change it to 0.3, and then my y to be 0.0, negative 2, 3, about like that, and you can adjust the. Ooh, that's way too small.
What's the purpose of the box collider there?
To trigger anything that you would run into, or if someone shot you, that actually triggers that a collision has been detected. So colliders are to interact to let you know that you've hit something within the world that you've created.
Right, and you just put the circle collider to make the
Yeah, I was
round
just
more realistic.
Exactly.
So you don't need the box collider.
Well, it depends. If I only had the circle as far as the feet, and if I got hit in the chest without that box collider, then it would never register. A bullet would go. A bullet would go right through me, and like, hey, well, why the hell is Matt not dying? You know, so.
The game.
Yeah, exactly. When Dan plays me, my box collider's turned off.
So you could build them up into more complex arrangements.
Yes, in fact, this wouldn't be the approach that I would go. I would create prefabs, and within those prefabs, everything would be preset, so that I would have individual components. I'm just showing you from a standpoint of just understanding.
I thought you were adding the ceiling and the feet for the colliders. Why did you add the ceiling?
No, the ceiling and the feet are ray casting so that to tell me how far I am from the ground. When I want to jump, the collider, when I apply a force, I can just do that, and I can apply a force to the game object so that it'll lift off the ground because it's physics-based, and then it'll come back. If I want a game that's more like Donkey Kong or Mario that doesn't use physics, it's all just manual physics where they're just applying velocity or force themselves. It's not applying a force, it's a translate. They perform a translation of move from here to here over lerping over a certain amount of time. I would want to have ray casting to tell me, am I back on the ground? And once I'm back on the ground, can then I jump again? Or if I'm on the ground and I hit jump again, can I do a double jump? And once I've done that, now is my distance too far away? So
that would be used in the scripting too.
Yes. In fact, yes. That's why I've called them floor and ceiling. That's why they're childs of here. In my script, I would say, in my player object, it's a transform. I would say get component, and then actually I wouldn't do it this way. I would actually do it by another concept that you guys haven't seen yet. I would apply a tag, maybe player, but for me, I would actually create a tag called ceiling. And I would call that, and then I can then go back to my ceiling object and apply ceiling. Likewise, I can do the same thing with floor. When you're dealing with your game, there may be specific tags, and a tag is just like a string representation that you can reference in code and say, for this player, give me all shields that he has, or give me all weapons that he has. If you tag him, then it'll give you back a collection of those, or a single one if you want to reference just one. But it makes it really nice and easy to deal with that. The other thing I want to show you guys here, just really quickly, is that physics I think still works. I don't think I broke anything. Yeah. Oh, and I can adjust the camera. It looks really far away, but I can do, I think, no, what is it? Size. There we go. Got 2. So this makes it, depending on the size, you can change how things would look in your game. You will adjust that when you actually target different devices, because you want it to scale so that it fits and fits perfectly across that. And the size of the camera actually tells you how close it is. It's a lot easier in orthographic or 2D games and how far it is, because everything's pretty much flattened out. We've got the colliders. We've got the rigid body so that it would fall. There's another concept though, and I was talking about parallax scrolling of layers. Right now, my player is on a default layer, and let me call this platform or something. Oh yeah. The platform is on the default layer. If I move this to, well, let's add a layer and just call it platform. The reason why I'm showing you this is because this is important, especially when you start dealing with enemies and other characters. But move this to platform. Watch what happens now. Oh, it still works. Hold on. Oh, damn it. Project settings, physics 2D. Here it is. Oh boy, it's really small to see. You get this nice matrix down here. It's kind of hard to see. Let me see if I can. I don't know why. Can I turn all that off? See if it renders differently. No, it doesn't. This layer collision matrix is really important when you start dealing with complex objects. For me, the platform, I don't want to be able to interact with default. So I take platform off of default, and I think that actually will do it. So if I hit save, oh, I haven't created a scene, and then go back in here. There we go. The reason I'm bringing this up is you may have you may have a multiplayer game, and you may have a mode that says people on the same team can't hurt each other, but enemies can. So I would put all my team members on one layer, and then the enemy on another layer, or vice versa, so that I could control what actually interacts with that. This matrix here is how you configure things. So you'll find that you'll get elaborate as far as what can collide with what. If I'm running and I see boxes and I can jump on that, but you know what, a box could never collide with the wall, or whatever you want to do, you can define it and get to that granularity. But I wanted to show you, because I changed that layer, adding a layer, everything is always opt-in. So you always get, it's optimistic. You're always going to interact with it. You can come over here and override and say, no, I don't ever want it to do that. If you tune it, that actually is going to optimize your game as well from a standpoint of how many colliders it actually watches for a given layer. So when you're interacting with your game.
What are those labels? Default?
Okay, yeah, excellent question. I just added this one called platform. Let's go right here. All those layers are what you see here, and then you can add as many layers as you want as well. Okay. So I would add, maybe platform. I would probably add another one called background, foreground, enemy, player, layers like that, so that I can interact with and turn on and off what actually needs to happen within the game.
So if you set up these layers, unless you tell them, hey, this layer works with you, they're just like totally independent. And
Um,
what happens on this front layer isn't going to be.
No, just the opposite. By default, all layers interact with each other. So they'll always trigger and say, I remember when I tested it, as soon as I added it, it still hit it, even though it was on a different layer. So by default, Unity will actually include it and say, I want you to interact with it. You have to, so it's optimistic. You have to go in and say, remove it, and tell it not to interact. So yeah, let me see where I am. I think I've
Can you
been.
do that in code too?
Yes. Oh, yes. Anything that you can do in the editor, as far as properties within any of the settings, you can change dynamically, and that's the power of Unity. Is that at any point in time, in fact, it's a perfect example, Dan. When your game first starts, you may have a 5-second invincibility or 3-second. I don't know. Nothing can kill me. Whatever layer it's coming from can't kill me. I turn everything off for player, but then after 3 seconds, it's game on. You're going to die, type of thing. And we'll actually look at that at the very last demo I do from Uframe today. So yeah, let me jump back and see where we were. I think we've got a pretty good view of what scene looks like. Any questions up to now as far as understanding or more puzzling or not? Okay. Just a quick note about the scene window. You can have as many scenes as you want in a game. Typically, I'll have a home scene or a welcome scene or a main menu scene, and then I'll have level scenes that I can load multiple levels. With what head trainer, I think that would maybe be a good option, is just having a single scene, the welcome or your main scene, which would be the stuff that you guys are doing for all the menuing, and then each of the games or the sub games would be their own scenes as well, and you could load those in dynamically. And that'll allow for a nice encapsulation if you don't do asset bundling, and I know that Teal has mentioned possibly doing that as well, but at least to keep separation of concerns as you're developing your games. All right.
Are the scenes in Head Trainer for like the welcome and stuff like that, are those 3D scenes, 2D scenes?
I think it's I think he's using 3D because he had a sphere.
We're using 3D, so we have the option, but
Yeah.
it's totally going to depend on.
So our games then can either be 2D or 3D.
Yeah, they want that.
Yeah, and each scene can be different. You could have a different camera. Just because I picked 2D does not mean I can't interact with 3D, and vice versa. The one thing that you have to be careful about is if you have a 2D game, or if you're building a 2D world and you want to interact with a 3D object, you can't. You have to programmatically do something, add a tag and do it yourself. The rigid bodies, the colliders will not, a 2D collider will not interact with a 3D collider, and vice versa. But there's nothing stopping you from creating a 3D game within this game, but then having the next game only be 2D. So as far as scenes go.
Okay.
Every scene has its own dedicated camera, and the camera is actually what dictates whether you're perspective or not, from 2D or not.
Oh yeah, just one other question.
Yeah.
The toolbar up there that had like the changing the X, Y, and the rotation.
Mm-hmm.
There's two of them that are like stretch type things. What's the difference between those two?
This guy here will scale. So let me go back and select player. So if I were to select this would scale it out that way. Or here. This guy here allows me to do both axes. As well as, I believe, if I hold the shift or the alt, no. I can also adjust, what key is it? This orientation tells me at what point do I rotate. So, for example, if I die, I don't want my sprite to be running and then all of a sudden, because my center is right here, and I want to lay down, to be 3 feet off the ground because I've rotated at the rotation point being in the middle. I would want my rotation point to always be at the bottom, and you can adjust it. I just don't know what key press it is to change that. Does that make sense though?
No.
Okay, so if I I'm not going to use just water in this. I'm moving this character around. My point of rotation is right here, dead in the middle.
All right.
Okay. The moment I die, I say, oh, I want to rotate it so it lays on its side, relative to where it is on the ground. So it's right here. If I rotate it, it's not going to be on the ground because then I'd have to push down. It would be like that, right?
Yeah.
Right dead center. So instead, if I want Unity to work properly, I want to say instead of making the point of rotation be right in the middle, I'll put it down at the bottom. When I put it in the bottom, then it'll rotate properly. So things like that you can adjust. You can do that also in the sprite. So if I go back here.
But if you had the normal gravity physics, it would rotate higher but still be on the ground.
Oh, yes, you're right. Yes, you would if physics is still turned on. So it just depends on what you interact with and how you want it to work. So it just depends.
So if you wanted to apply like a force vector or something like that, would that be a shape that you put on there?
No. The moment you have a rigid body, you have enlisted into physics. You can do whatever you want against that
Like if
object.
there's wind or something like that.
Well, that's resistance. So you can, within my rigid body, I have drag, I have a gravity scale, and then an angular drag, depending on what angle I'm at. So I could apply wind. So if I'm moving, if wind's coming from in front of me and I'm moving to the right, I just apply more drag. So if I'm moving to the right, instead of it going at speed 5, now it's at speed 4.3 because the wind has impacted my drag.
Okay.
So you can do things like that to increase, and that can either be done by what are they called? I'll think of the term, but there's a lot of them that are like slick or ice or sand that you can apply as a material to the object that you have on the ground to impact how fast he moves. So if it was ice, everything is super slick. If it was sand, then I would actually move slower than I would at the normal speed if it was without it. And those can be pre-baked. You can just add and remove those.
If you had ground that looked like this,
Mhm.
and gravity turned on, you hit the ground and you have like a sphere collision detection, would it
Mhm.
slide down this way? Or
Yes,
would it stop?
yes, it would. So you have to, well, and depending upon the resistance on both the objects. But yes, if it were a sphere and it was sliding like that, or it was angled like that, you would start moving depending on how strong gravity is. And you can apply, and your mass.
All right.
The smaller your mass, the less gravity is going to impact it.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, that's an excellent question. In fact, we can try that right now.
And those parameters are part of Unity or part of one of the physics engines?
It's all part of Unity. Yeah. Yep. So let's try that, Dan. So I'm going to go ahead and take my my platform, and I'm going to move it down a little bit further too. So, and then I'm going to rotate it. Let's just see what happens. Oh, you know what else we want to see? Let me change the change this back to default. You're not going to see it once it gets out of the spectrum of the camera, right? So hopefully I can just do this and things will just still work. So
The camera's part of the,
I made the camera a child so it would follow the character, but for some reason when it hit this, it actually rotated this guy. Let me see if I can make him.
if you pull the camera out.
The camera rotated with the
Yeah.
object. The object went sideways.
Okay, well let's just make the camera space larger then. Let me move that out. And then size. What was it at for? 5, that looks better.
This is cooler than I thought, more complicated too. Ooh.
See, there you go. And he rotated. Now,
And he fell off the
That
end.
was one thing I wasn't expecting.
and
So how do you get it to stop?
Validate that the earth is flat.
I can make
That is correct.
I can make this a fixed angle, and what that means is that he will not rotate.
I love the rotation, that was the coolest thing.
So there. So you can turn that on and off, but in fact, just to show you when I go in the debugger, there, now I can turn it back on.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's really cool. This stuff was a time. It's a lot of fun. And just as a caveat, I have found that game developing is probably one of the hardest there is, but it improves all your other development as well, especially when you start dealing with asynchronous and optimizing your code. You're going to find that you're going to employ patterns that you can employ in every other type of program that you're doing. So it's a good thing, in my opinion, and it's, besides the paradigm shift. So let me jump back and see where we were, since Dan's been taking over my presentation.
Sorry.
You're fine. Okay, so again, a lot of these I think we've already seen, but the game window, one of the cool things that you can do, and I'll show you this in a second, is that you can actually target whether or not you're standalone, what size. You can plug in into any device that your platform that you're targeting custom ranges or custom resolutions. I typically, if I'm doing iOS, want to load the iOS platform because it comes pre-baked with all the phones and stuff like that, or Android. But there's nothing stopping me at any point in time to actually putting in an iOS resolution on this PC platform that I'm targeting right now. The other thing that I can do, which I haven't yet, is I can target and say, make this go in the game, maximize. If I do that, yeah, it's the whole screen. And I know Dan's going to be upset until I turn that back off. So there we go. So, and I could apply a material here to make this slicker or rougher so that the resistance would be higher or lower. If I change the mass of my guy to, let's say, 10, watch it now. That really wasn't that much more. I'd have to bump it up higher. But it should impact how fast and how heavy it is.
Technically, it feathers should fall the same speed.
Gravity's
as the
32%.
ball.
Yeah, maybe not. Then I don't know. When two interact, I know that one would fly away and the other one would bounce a little bit. So I was hoping that it would go a little bit faster, but it's not. You could. So, so here I can.
Impact the speed, like beyond just.
You made the surface more rough, it would not drag down as quickly.
Correct.
Rip the skin that you scratch, but if you
Here's.
a mass of 10, 1,500 pound person hitting the ground on glass.
Yeah. Shatter it.
Yeah.
So we have maximize and play. I can also turn on statistics. So when I'm running it, I can actually see how many frames per second I'm going, 70, 80. A lot of good statistics that you can look at, how many draw calls. This actually took 2 draw calls. You know why it took 2 instead of 1? No. How about sprites? We're in 2D and we're doing sprites. What did I do? I know I just introduced the concept, so I'll show you. The player and the platform each have a sprite. When you look at it, these sprites are individual files because they're not into a single what we call atlas or sprite sheet. The renderer has to draw each one individually. So from a mobile perspective, that sucks. You want to keep the draw calls as low as possible, if within reason. So if you have, especially for these simple assets, and I'll show you when I deploy Mad Dash on this machine what that looks like. You're going to see sprite sheets that are always power of 2 for mobility as well. iOS will not optimize anything that's outside of power of 2. It'll still use it, but iOS will actually compress it and optimize it in the operating system as well for the phone or for the iPad. So you want to make sure that all of your assets that you deal with are always power of 2 from a size standpoint. If you're
How do you control the power of 2 size of a sprite?
well, then just go to Photoshop and say 256 or 1024.
Okay.
Make sure the size is always that size.
It's an even power.
Yeah, it's an even power. It has to be both height and width. So, in fact, let me further qualify that. For iOS, it has to be the same. It has to be rectangular. So it's always 1024 has to be 1024 wide as well as high. Pick which one you want. A tool like Texture Packer will do that for you and make life much easier. It just depends on how you guys deal with your assets, your graphics. If it's a separate art department that does it and then ships it back to you, are they doing the animations, and is it an animation sprite set with each in the individual PNG is going to be that for transparency, or how are you going to handle for that? But it is nice to understand why we saw 2 draw calls, and the reason being is because we had 2 separate sprites applied from different sheets. So if we combine them to one, we don't only have 1 single draw call. So you have statistics, gizmos. I can turn those on during the game if I want to see what's happening. Why is the ceiling not working? Turn the gizmos on. See if it actually is interacting properly. So it's nice. Once you create those gizmos, you can see them in the game as well. And I like to see that just in case there's this concept of if you apply a force that's too fast in Unity, you need to set it as a bullet. Otherwise, it'll actually go right through any collider and never register and stop. When I was first playing games and trying to do these simple shooters like asteroids, every time I hit an asteroid, it hit it, but it didn't, because it would always go straight through it. It's because my velocity was too high, and until I actually knew that I had to make it as a bullet, the concept as a bullet, I didn't know that, and so it would, just because I was applying too much force, it would go right through it, never register it. So little things like that can frustrate you, but if you want to make sure that it actually is hitting it, you can turn those gizmos on to visualize that. All right. So I think I covered those. If you, the last thing. This you have to toggle back on and off. So if, a lot of times for me when I'm developing, I never maximize unless, let me further qualify. I do that if I have multiple monitors. If I have a single monitor, I would never do that, because a lot of times I want to debug, I want to change something or look at something. So that's kind of the only difference. This is free aspect. Whatever the size of the screen that it's in, it'll fit that. But I can target, and now you're seeing letterboxing. Oh, and now it's going to just be that size, which is fine. But it's nice because then I can quickly just go through. If I want my own custom, I can define it right there, and I'll remember that. So little things like that you'll find that you'll be creating depending on the resolution and the target of the device that you want to be on. And you're going to want to check all these sizes in your game before you ever deploy, just to make sure it looks good there. But then that's not enough. You still want to go to the device to make sure the camera's working properly. Okay, let me jump back. That's where I had to. Okay, we've looked at this already, so I'm just going to kind of jump through this fairly quickly. But the hierarchical window in and of itself is truly that. It's a hierarchical representation of whatever you have in your scene. So if you wanted to, and you wanted to have madness in your world, you could have everything in the same sibling at the same level, which probably wouldn't work. You'd have to do a lot of custom coding to make things interact with each other. The best approach is to group things and to even create what we call empty game objects, that all they are is just placeholders, buckets. So I created, let me show you that. I would create one here. Since I only have one platform, let's make this game a little bit more fun. And I'm going to duplicate this guy, bring it down. We'll have to make our camera a little bit bigger. Rotate it the other way, because I know we want to see it truly fall. And then move them out over here. So now I have two platforms. What I can do here is create an empty game object and just say platforms, and then nest these guys inside of here. I'm just creating a bucket, container. You would never really in program in the code never really use it unless you wanted to get the collection of all platforms inside of that. You could then say get all game objects, child game objects, children game objects within that. But it's more from a just housekeeping for the hierarchy and how things are laid out. But now that I have this set up, I can just collapse it, and I don't have to worry about it because I set it up once, put it away, leave it alone. Let me go to my camera to make sure I can see both. I can't, so let's make this higher, even higher. Almost. Yeah, you're not going to see it now, but
Really?
so you can do little things like that, but it shows you the power from the hierarchy manager, the ability to do housekeeping or just structure within it.
Would that turn the platforms into a sprite, or that's a totally separate concept?
Well, in 2D, the platforms are sprites. Is what are being rendered.
So we could still choose sprites.
Yeah, just the grouping and putting them under there doesn't change. Think of a printer. So when I'm or not a printer, but when I want to label something, I could use a single stamp. So let's say my address, and I'm ready to send out, and I just stamp my address on there. If I have one stamp and I stamp both of them, I'm only using one resource. But say, for example, I have a stamp and my wife has a stamp. It's the same name, but because she has her own desk, she wants hers as well. So I stamp mine. She goes and stamps hers. Now we're actually using two different resources. That's the same thing as what Unity is doing. Is if I give a sprite sheet and I save it as a single file for player, but then for the platform, I have another file for doing that. When I run this, it will still do 2 draw calls, even though I have 2 platforms and 1 player. So total count is 3. But the reason why it's only 2 draw calls is because the other 2 platforms are sharing the same sprite. Let me turn statistics on to make sure I'm not lying to you. And run it. Oh, 3 draw calls. Oh, I know what, because they're not prefabs yet. So that's another thing that we haven't jumped into yet. Prefabs allow us to create classes or things that we can instantiate so that it reuses the same resources. Right now, these are saying pull duplicate, yeah. So, and we'll look at that in a second. All right, so I think we've covered the hierarchy of how things go there. Oh, one last thing. Let me run this guy again. Okay, I have paused, and if you ever need to just see what's happening frame by frame, you can just click this, and this is actually playing frame by frame what's happening in the game. So you can run it and then pause and say, well, right here I know he's about to fall. What's going to happen here? So sometimes it's important to see what happens at an individual frame level to look at things. So
the point of having frames is that in between, well, when a frame fires, you can do code on each frame. Or is it actually, there's more to it?
Well, yeah, you've got an animation, or you got the dope sheet that actually deals with the timeline. So depending on what, I'm not sure what you'd want to do. So what you're trying to do. If I'm trying to think of something that I want to do at individual frames. Unity, which we're going to talk about in a second, has the concept of everything is in a game loop, and it has updates. You have the concept of doing real-world time, and then you have delta time, which is always making sure that when the game plays, it doesn't stutter. If you're just using a regular time, real-world time, the more objects you put on the window, the slower you'd see some stuttering of it. So it uses something called delta time, and that will always coordinate updates so that it draws everything smoothly, regardless of how many objects you have. You have to enlist to make sure that you do the right thing with the update. So if you're coding the update, because that's going to fire every frame, you've got to make sure that's as clean and as tight as possible.
Basically painting it at each frame. There's nothing in between a frame.
Yeah. And so, but there are other timelines within the game. So for animations, for example, an idle stance. If the character's moving left or right, running or jumping, and then you just don't do anything for 3 seconds, he changes his animation to come on, or little things like that. You can do that time-based, that are really independent of the frame loop of the engine, but are completely dependent upon the character.
So dependent on the device it's running on. It's like my Android phone might be slower or faster than.
Yeah, and as long as you use delta time, which is update and fixed update, it's going to try to do the best it can. But if you keep adding more and more objects to the game engine in itself, at some point it's going to bomb, but it just depends. You have to test on those devices. Most of the games that we're dealing with, in a lot of them, you use optimizations like baking, object scaling, or caching. And what that is, instead of me actually creating an instance of every single object that I need in my world, and then destroying an object in Unity is very expensive and creation, because then it lets the garbage collector have to grab that memory. Caching, you create an array of all the objects that you want. You at like loading, when you do a loading sequence, you would create all those objects in memory up front, and then for example, if you had a runner that's going from left to right and you have I don't know, platforms that are moving in and getting destroyed, instead of me doing instantiate, all I'm doing is through probably a randomizer is resetting the X and Y position so that it resets it and then wraps back around. That's going to be much more efficient from a standpoint than doing instantiation, which will help mitigate the slowdown or the feel of the game being slow on a mobile device. But you're right. I typically draw a line in the sand and say I'm only going to support X version of Android, X version of iOS, and then Windows if I need to or if I want to. That
So
X
the frame
version.
rate's a setting, you don't
Mhm.
like.
You can play with it, and it depends on the scene that you have. If your scene is fairly static, you could reduce the frame rate, and focus on that, because then that means that the game will run a little bit smoother.
You're talking about the render?
Yes, you can control that.
Game loop?
hmm So you can change any of those as well, but for the most part, I let Unity optimize and pick because you saw how it was fluctuating. It's going to try to do the best it can with the scene that it has and with what it's trying to render. And for the most part, it does a really good job. It's up to us to make sure that the draw calls, simple things that, if we just created all these sprites individually, if it was a big enough game, you would see that and you would start noticing, especially on a mobile device, hey, this is a simple 2D game. Why is it running crappy? Well, it's because for every single object we're creating, we're having to do a separate draw call. Instead, they could be reduced in theory down to 1 or 2 because of the fact that you could share the same sprite sheet. So things like that, you could find some really good optimizations for when you target mobility. So yeah, that was the step you through the frames. And a project panel we've already kind of looked at, but the biggest thing is with the project panel is that only manage your assets within Unity if you can. Don't use Visual Studio, don't use Windows Explorer unless Unity is open. I can add things to the folders, so if I had assets or sprites or sounds in Windows Explorer, I can add it to that, and as long as Unity is open, it will recognize it. But for the most part, they say, don't play with fire. Use what it's trying to do, because it does a lot of management behind the scenes with meta files to keep things in sync. It's just smarter just to I just drag it from Windows Explorer into the project panel, the window itself, and drop it there and let it do what it needs to.
And then he copies that? He's doing
Yeah, he creates it and he puts it in, it becomes part of this. Project is our file system structure, so it's basically a mini Windows Explorer, but it's doing more than just that. So when you drop it there, it actually puts it in that location. It stores that. In fact, the project structure is important, even more so when we talk about U-Frame, because U-Frame has its own concept of where things need to go as far as projects. But I typically separate my materials, my shaders, my sprites, my sounds, and have folders specific for each one of those. I wouldn't do them across scenes, with the caveat being that it sounds like you guys are going to do multiple teams, so that makes more sense if you do asset bundles, which means mini Unity games, loading those in. Because if I create scene-specific assets, then it's making it more of a nightmare to maintain all of those. But it just depends on what type of game you're doing. If you have multiple games like what we're doing here, it may make more sense to have a strict folder structure. In game one, everything for that game as far as assets. The only thing I would say is that if you have anything in common, bring them up to the top level. So all scenes or all games can reference them instead of, I've got to go into game 4 for this one asset that I needed because I'm in game 7. Just common sense as far as how you structure that when you're setting it up. All right, the inspector panel, we've already seen this, extremely powerful. I want to point out again, you've got player, you got tag, and you got layers. Those are extremely important, especially in your scripting and in how the world interacts with each other. You also have the select, reconnect, and apply. Depending on whether or not your game object is a prefab, that dictates what you can do. And let me just jump right there and just show you what I mean by that. I want to make my player a prefab. The way I do that, in fact, I'm going to actually create a folder here, and I always have one called prefabs, is I just grab the player and I will drag him into the prefabs folder. It can be any folder. It doesn't have to be prefabs, but that's what I call it. You'll notice here, hopefully, if you're not colorblind, that this guy now changed to blue. Any prefab that you use from your hierarchy, from your project, and you drag it into the hierarchy, will be blue. And that helps you see, well, which objects am I using that I can create instances of, and which objects are just static. I would do the same thing with my platforms, and then just drag here. The nice thing about that, and I might delete this guy.
Now you got to create the other one from the prefab.
Exactly. That's why I deleted him, because I wanted to use the same thing. But the cool thing about that is that I can change. Say, for example, that color is just awful. I can change that in all platforms. So let me drag another one out here. And now, if I go back to the game scene just to see it, if I wanted to, with the platform selected, change anything to green or whatever I wanted. See how all the platforms, all my prefabs are updating. Boy, that was really hard to see.
But you can change them individually also?
Yes, and here's the caveat. If I want to change them individually, but I don't want to update the, well, let me move this back down here. I don't want to update the parent prefab, never hit apply. So with this guy selected, I want to say, you know what, this bottom one, he's going to be fire. So I'm going to make him red. And I can do that. As long as I don't hit apply here, it will not override the parent object of the prefab itself. If I don't like that, I can hit revert, and it'll bring back all the properties from that prefab. It's really powerful, but do not screw it up. Don't go the wrong way and you're like, oh, I spent hours setting this prefab up and I just screwed something over. Or you just use Control Z. You can back that out. But you're right.
You dragged it to the prefab folder.
Mhm.
Did you set a property or make it a prefab, or just?
Yes. No, I didn't. The act of moving something from my hierarchy to my project makes it a prefab itself. That act of doing that makes it a
Create a
prefab.
file on your file system.
Mm-hmm. It's saying, hey,
Platform.
yep, I now like this. I want you to honor this now as a given prefab so that I can now reuse that. All your games are going to be prefabs for the most part as far as things that are going to get used and interchanged.
Run your game with this.
Okay. Where is, oh, it's over here. Still 3. And it's because it's not using that sprite sheet, an individual one. So yeah, I think that was the last one. Oh, the other thing I mentioned here is that if I was on the player and then I wanted to grab something, we haven't really talked about scripting yet, but scripts you can actually reference, and they'll expose as properties maybe a platform, and I wanted to drag that platform to fill that reference. I could lock this guy, because right now if I click on anything else, it's going to change it. And then if I wanted to grab something from here, as long as I don't lift up, I'm okay. But the moment I lift up, I didn't mean to do that. I'm kind of screwed. So I can just lock it, and then anything I select will always still be in that context. It's useful if you're trying to set, if you have a really busy or complicated game object like a player or like something that's or your camera that you're trying to set all these properties up, and you don't want each button press to reset it or change it. Just remember to set it back if you're trying to look at something when you're running the game. The other thing I was going to show you here is that this guy can have two where you can get visualizations of your prefabs, what you're looking at. I usually almost always, at least when I'm on smaller real estate, set it just to one column. But if you wanted that and you don't see, well, why can't I see that? It's just right here. The other thing that you can do is I can, at any point in time, move these down or make it completely independent, or even close it, but then go back to layout and say, oh, I want 2x3, or I want 4 split, which really would suck for the way we have it, or default, which actually puts it over here. So there's a lot of different layouts that you can use, to take a look at things. When you first load Unity, and if you don't have a scene loaded, you need to double click the scene so that it'll actually get loaded into memory so that it'll render it. This is really important when you actually have a project that has multiple scenes. If nothing shows up, you're like, what happened to my game? I'm not seeing anything in my scene editor or my game. It's just because you haven't loaded that scene. So don't get worried if nothing shows up at first. All right, let's see. Animation window. You need to have a prefab first in order to interact with the animation, but I can show you. So this isn't really going to be a good example, this guy here, but to get to the window, you've got animation and you've got animator. The animation window, you can create new clips, which are time-based. I'm going to just create, and I typically put it in an animations folder, but for right now I'll just leave it like this. And I'll just create one called idle. And then I can add a curve to the transform. I don't know what I'd want to do here, since it's pretty simple, but I could probably do like a simple rotation. And then I can just go over here with the player selected and go to my rotation, if I can see it.
This just gives you keyframe.
Yeah, allows me to modify at any point in time what this would look like. And then I can bring this in. I can play and see what this would look like. So if I wanted to do some sort of walking animation or something like that, I could do that. Because I have that set, and this is something to be careful about. When the record button is pressed, your play, pause, and sample frames are going to turn red. And what that means is that anything in my inspector, any property, not just the character that I have, I can modify, and it's going to record that as part of the animation. So if I change the background, if I move the camera, anything that I want, it's going to record that for that one animation. So just be careful. With great power comes, or whatever. But I've gotten bitten many times because I've forgotten to turn that off, and then I started working on something else. So just be sure that when you're done with that, you turn that off and you move on. But now I have an idle. I could add another one, maybe called walk or whatever. I'm not going to do anything with it, but and then you'll see that I have two. From a programming standpoint, I still don't have anything that I can actually address and communicate with. So that's where the animation animator window comes in. So this is the animation, this is the animator, and I'll show you that. And this is the thing where it may make sense to either do this in Unity or to do it in 3ds Max. A 2D, there's plenty of 2D animation toolkits, or creating sprite sheets. It just depends. But what you have here is that you can go from any state and transition to something. What you see as orange is going to be the default state that character that has that animator applied to it is in. So when we first start out, you're going to have a single animation. And then you could say, you know what, I want to be able to create a parameter, and I may call it, I'll just make it simple. No, I'm going to do it as a trigger instead. And I'll just describe what the differences are. Get rid of that. Within the parameters, you have float, int, bool, and trigger. Float, int, and bool, you call through the animator, and you say set, and then whatever, set bool, set int, set float. And that'll set the value. It'll remain that way until you tell it not to. Trigger, the moment you trigger that, it'll switch it, and then it'll switch back to whatever the default animation was. So if you get shot, maybe a grunt, you want to trigger that so it plays a sound as part of the animation and then go back to the running or to whatever other sounds that you have. You can do something like that. The way you set these up is that you right-click and you say make transition, and you drag it to wherever you want to go. You select it, and then you define a condition that says, what actually dictates me going from my idle animation to my walking animation? This guy is going to give me not only an explicit exit time after 3 seconds, switch back, or it'll give me any of the properties that I set up in my property settings there. So typically for a 2D game, between these animations, I'll have a float that gives me my position, and based on whether or not my position has changed, either positive for going forward or negative for going backwards, then I know whether or not to go into a walking or running, depending on how fast that transition is. I'll have like an off the ground parameter that's a Boolean to know whether or not I'm in the air, so I can do a floating or some sort of falling type of animation. But they'll all be exposed here. If I wanted to, I could just have it go to walking and just do it for, point, 0.04, and it'll automatically go straight back. If I wanted to make the transition, well, for this it doesn't make sense to have it go back because it's a trigger. It'll automatically go back, but I could do this here as well and say, I want you to come back at 0.75, so actually it doesn't, I'd have to set this up to make it smooth, 0.75.
You got like loopers on those animations, go do this 3 times, or would you just call it, trigger it 3 times?
Yeah, you would call it, you wouldn't, the animator window doesn't deal with looping, it just defines states that you can go into. It's a statement, it's basically a state machine. What states can I go to and what states can I have? The one thing to be aware of is that this animator that I'm playing with right now can only be in one and only one state at any given time. So if I have, trying to think of a good example, a character that may be Rambo, and he's got his headband, and that headband's flowing in the wind, but he's also getting ready to shoot, those would be 2 separate animators for Rambo, right? One, because I wouldn't be able to show headband flowing in the wind as well as shoot in a single state. I would actually have 2 separate state engines. And that's actually the best practice to do that. The way you would handle for that in your animator is you would just create a new layer. And that new layer would allow us to define. So for any given character or any given game object, you could have as many animation sequences playing at one time that you want. But for any layer, you can only play one in one state. So if that makes sense. So I can only be walking state, but I could also be, blowing smoke with my cigar or something like that from another layer for that same animator. And that's how you can do parallel things that run concurrently. And a lot of times, if you've never played with the animator, you don't know that, and so you start creating this huge spaghetti mesh of a state machine that, running with cigar, running without cigar, things like that. Keep it simple, just add layers, and that really keeps your code clean. This piece here in the animation window is important, but UFrame has its own state machine, and it uses ReactiveX, which is really powerful. So switching between animations, you're probably going to still want to create the animation itself, either outside in Photoshop or something like that, and then bring bring them together using the animation window with the dope sheet and the timeline. But then switching between that, you may not even use the animator at all. You may just use the state machines from Uframe. We'll look at that in a sec afterwards. Where else was I? Just go through it. Yeah, so if you want to have multiple states, you just add layers, which you do right here. And then the parameters. So here for mine, I had a speed. So if I was positive, I knew I was going forward. If I was negative, I was going backwards. Whether I was on the ground in crouching, and V just meant vertical. How fast was I going up or down? So for this one I was doing. All right. Okay, so the sprite editor window, I probably have some sprites I can show you. The one thing is that when you bring in a sprite and you drop it into Unity, that sprite is only, it's going to by default just think it's just one single sheet and it's one representation or one sprite. You have to manually go in and say, no, that's not the case. Let me see if I can find one here. I actually want it to be something else. So I have Mad Dash. Okay. So I'm just going to grab a sprite. Oh, wrong folder. And no, I like the fox. We'll do the fox. And while I'm in here, oh, it changed, didn't it? Damn you. Just drop it into the assets. You see now that I added it? Okay. When I select this, see how it says it's a texture, it's a 2D and UI because it now supports the new GUI. It has sprite mode of single, and it always will be that way unless I say multiple. The moment I say multiple, then we'll see what that means. And then sprite editor. In here, I can zoom. I believe, where's my zoom? There we go. You'll see that for the most part, I got this from Open Game Art. This is part of my Infinite Runner game, but just these sprites, and I tried to put them in here so that they're all the same position. But the nice thing about what Unity does is that when I say slice, automatic center, that pivot point that we were talking about, Dan, where it was in the chest, this is where you would determine when you bring in a sprite where that pivot point is. So if I know that I'm always going to be running and I'm always going to be standing up for the most part as my interaction, then I would probably say bottom so that everything happens from my feet as far as rotation. But you can keep it center and handle for that as well. So I'll just say that, and then I'll just say slice. Can you guys see that? It automatically created some rectangles around that. Depending on how good your graphics are, if you have some fuzzy or some other, they accidentally stroke something like that, it'll recognize that. Or if you don't have enough space between your sprites themselves, it'll think it's one. You can go around and actually draw it, but it always has to be in the shape of a rectangle. You can't do freeform in Unity. But it is nice because once I do this and I hit apply, watch what happens here. I now have all of my sprites that I can now, in my animation window, apply and show that it's doing running, jumping, whatever I want. So I personally like doing it in here, and that's just because the less tools I have to depend upon, the better. And if I just want to learn Unity, I'll just use Unity and let it do everything for me. But for me, I do all of my animation management in GIMP, and then I bring them all together using Texture Packer, which allows me to put them all into a single atlas. But so I can apply any of those, and it's really easy to just drag the sprites that I want, put them on the scene, and just test and look at it. But ultimately, when I'm fine tuning, I would actually go into the animator window it's pretty cool once you start dealing with real assets. The biggest trick that people get stuck on, myself included, is when I first brought this in, it was always single, and I didn't know what the heck. Why? I know there's a ton of these on there. Why not? You switch it to multiple, and then go to the editor. And then once you're in the editor, you can do that. If at any point in time I wanted to change one of these or make it look differently, I could, just by resizing it. The other thing to be aware of is I like to name my sprites, give them a meaningful name. For me, it was just called Fox, which is fine for me. But if I had it, Fox 1024 by something like that, it's going to create every single instance of these guys with an underscore, the number, how many it's done. See how that's changing? So it's important that you name them. I've gone as far as actually with the Donkey Kong lab I did at Microsoft, where we did that workshop. I labeled everything with the name ladder because it was a full sprite sheet. Now everything was in that one single sprite sheet. Ladder, Mario. What his name isn't called Mario. What is he called again? Yeah, it's not Mario though. I guarantee you. If you look at the original game that they did, I'll think of his name, but it doesn't really matter. Mario, Ladder, Donkey, Princess. All of those I'd actually give those names here so that when I reference them in code or through the sprite selector, it's better than maybe it was Donkey Kong sprite sheet underscore 128. That's not as meaningful. So what I'm going to show you here is the skybox and terrain editor, which is the terrain. Unless you're doing a 3D game, for a 2D really doesn't need to be that much. But the cool thing about it is you could actually create a skyline that looked like Charlotte with the terrain editor, and then bake that out as an image, and then have that as your background. So you can. It doesn't just have to be only 3D graphics and rendering. It could be something that you could actually do. I would probably use Blender or something just because it's a full. It would generate the PNG or bitmap or whatever you want, but it's still pretty cool. If you wanted to play with terrains, all you would do is you would go to 3D object, terrain. Once I select terrain, I have these options here to do different things. So as you can see, I'm going to do probably the lightest. The moment I select something, it actually is trying to build the terrain that I want, and depending on whether I want to go positive or negative, I can actually build craters or not. The terrain in and of itself can have like a crust or a depth. So you can, the higher the depth, then you can build caverns or holes or something like that. The ceiling can go as high as you want, but sometimes you need to adjust the crust itself so that if you want to build things or tunnels and stuff like that that the game goes into, that you don't fall out and go into empty space. But once I have that, then I can go here and smooth it. I can change my paint height so that I have other options, and then say, okay, well, let me find a texture and then start painting. I didn't load that. I'd have to load that package. But the textures, then I could do grass, or I could do snow, I could do whatever, a path. So it's pretty nice to be able to do something like that. You can do little things like that and build out really elaborate worlds. Dan, his daughter, has built her own Minecraft world using Unity, and then he's got an avatar that she can run around in the world and interact with it. And so, but little things, she's the one that built it too, so it's kind of cool once he showed her the tools, how to paint and stuff. So that's that. And then from a skybox perspective, the only reason I'm getting these is because I loaded the skybox packages when I first started this project. So if you don't see them, if you guys want to play with them, don't be alarmed. It's just because I did that. I like this dusk to dawn. This gives you just an idea what you can do with regard to 3D effects. Skybox is just a material that has a sheet that's north, south, east, west, and then center. So like kind of the Rubik's Cube, and then it just folds to represent a 360 view. So it's pretty smart. In fact, let me show you. I think I have a, which we can do this later. So there's the train, skybox. That's what it kind of looks like, is that guy up there. It wraps around and actually becomes, instead of outside of the surface, it's inside the world that you're looking in. So we're actually in a ball. So wherever the camera looks at the skybox. So, but if you want, we can break and then I'll show you particles.